I have spent 35 years dropping weighted lines into water and reading what comes back. Depth, current, the shape of things that never see light. I know what it is to find the world has more underneath it than the surface suggests. I thought I understood that professionally. I did not understand it personally until the night of the Aldermere Trust Gala, when a dredger man sat down at a concert, grand in the belly of a restored dry dock, and played Chopin until nobody in that iron room could remember how to speak. I should tell you about dry dock number 3 first, because the place mattered. The Aldermere Trust had spent 6 years and most of a considerable bequest restoring the Victorian dry dock on the old tidal basin. The ironwork hull, the caisson gates, the gantry rigging that once held ships in cradle while the sea was pumped away beneath them. For their fundraising gala, they had lit the whole thing with hanging lanterns along the gantry rails, dressed the old dock floor in round tables and good linen, and installed, at the far end under the bow curve of the restored iron frame, a Bosendorfer grand that had no business being beautiful in a place that beautiful. It looked like a black seal asleep under a ship's rib. I arrived early, as I always do, and I stood for a while near the piano because I wanted to understand what it was doing there. I never answered the question to my satisfaction. I found a chair at a table near the port side wall, poured myself a glass of something cold, and watched the room fill. The evening's compere was a man called Gerald Farrant. Some of you will know the name. He presented a long-running television program about antiques and provenance. The sort of program where everything is either priceless or worthless, and the camera lingers on both with identical reverence. He had a broadcaster's face, firm chin, good hair, the kind of easy authority that fills a room before he has said anything. He had been engaged to anchor the auction portion of the evening and to keep the thing moving between lots, and he was very good at it. Warmth on tap, a joke with the right amount of edge. He knew how to make 60 people in a dry dock feel like they were at the center of something. I did not dislike him, but I noticed, as the evening wore on, that Gerald Farrant believed deeply in the natural order of things, and that the natural order of things, in his estimation, placed Gerald Farrant approximately at the top. Clift Marsh arrived late. He was not the sort of man events were built around. He was in his early 70s, broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way men get when they have spent 40 years doing physical work, with hands that looked as though they had been formed for some purpose other than holding a wine glass, which he managed awkwardly, shifting it from hand to hand, looking for somewhere to set it down. He had worked the tidal channels of the Aldermere Basin for most of his working life, operating the dredger that kept the silt from choking the navigation channels. He knew the floor of this basin the way I know my own charts. He had retired 3 years before, and he had come tonight, I gathered, because his daughter had bought him a ticket, and he had not wanted to disappoint her. He wore his best jacket. He had changed his boots. I noticed him when he stopped near the Bosendorfer. He did not touch it. He stood at a respectful distance, the way a man stands at a grave, and looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he moved on to find a table. Gerald Farrant noticed him too. The auction had finished. The band, a quartet that had played tasteful standards through the dinner, had packed their instruments into cases and carried them out. There was a gap in the program, the comfortable sort, where people refill glasses and nobody minds. Gerald Farrant was at the microphone, working the room through the gap with a few words about the Trust's next project, when his eye caught Clift Marsh drifting back toward the Bosendorfer. The old man had set his wine glass on the edge of the stage and was standing again, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the instrument. Gerald Farrant stopped mid-sentence. He smiled. The smile was warm, and it was completely theatrical. "I see we have a music lover in our midst," he said. His voice carried beautifully in the iron hull. "Sir, yes, you, the gentleman who seems rather taken with our rather magnificent piano. Don't be shy. Would you like to give us something? A little something salty, perhaps. A shanty, something the room can enjoy. Nothing too ambitious. We've had a lovely evening. We don't want to strain anyone." The room laughed. It was a comfortable laugh, easy and uncomplicated. The laugh of a room that had eaten well and was certain of where the evening was going. Clift Marsh turned around. He looked at Gerald Farrant for a moment with an expression I could not read from where I sat. Then he looked at the piano. He said, "All right then." No one had expected him to say yes. He walked to the Bosendorfer and pulled out the bench. He stood for a moment regarding it. then turned the height adjustment knob. 3 full turns, the motion unhurried and precise. The motion of a man who has done this calculation before. He sat. He placed his hands in his lap. He tilted his head once, the way a person does when listening to something only they can hear. A few people at the nearer tables exchanged glances. One man, gray-haired, a trust trustee whose name I never learned, set down his auction catalog slowly, as though the noise of it might matter. Gerald Farrant was still smiling, the microphone loose in one hand, ready to follow the shanty with a quip. He had already composed the quip, you could see it, stored behind his expression, waiting. Clift Marsh put his hands on the keys. What came out first was so quiet, the room nearly missed it. A melody in the upper register, pastoral, almost hesitant, like something half-remembered from a dream about countryside you have never visited. A woman near the stage had already opened her mouth to say something to her companion. She closed it again. The melody moved through the bass and the treble, with a slow, deliberate gentleness, passing between the hands, the way a conversation passes between two people who have known each other for decades and no longer need to speak loudly. I heard someone at the table to my left put down their glass. Not hard, just gently, as if they had suddenly realized they would rather not be holding anything. I want to be careful here, because I am not a musical person, and I am trying to tell you something true. The melody was simple enough, in those first measures, that 2 or 3 people near the bar continued their conversations for perhaps 20 seconds after Clift began. Low voices, a little laughter, and then, one by one, like candles going out in a draft, those conversations stopped. Not because anyone shushed them, because the music had done something to the air that made talking feel, not wrong, exactly, irrelevant, a tool you had forgotten the use of. I do not read music. I cannot tell you the technical grammar of what he was playing. What I can tell you is that in my profession, when you drop a sounding line into water that you expect to be shallow, and the weight keeps falling past the point where you calculated bottom, there is a particular sensation in the line, in your arm, in your understanding of the world beneath you. That sensation arrived in my chest somewhere in the second minute of Clift Marsh playing. The melody came back. It had changed. Something had entered it that had not been there before. Not louder, not faster, but different in the way a sky changes before weather arrives. The color barely shifted, but the light behind it entirely altered. A shadow under the pastoral. A pressure building the way pressure builds in tidal water meeting a narrowing channel. I found I was sitting forward in my chair without having decided to. The couple to my right had turned away from each other, and were both looking at the piano. A woman 3 tables over had her hand pressed flat on the table, fingers spread, as though steadying herself against a motion she could feel but not yet name. Gerald Farrant had lowered the microphone. Then the storm came. I do not have the language for what happened in the 3rd minute. I have the language of water, surge, bore, the roar a tidal race makes when the channel narrows, and the volume has nowhere else to go. I have the language of pressure measured in meters, of flow rates and turbulence, and the point at which a current exceeds the capacity of its bed. None of that language is sufficient. What I can tell you is this. The Bosendorfer seemed to become something other than a cabinet of wire and wood. It seemed to become the room's own accumulated feeling, given a mechanism through which to escape. The iron walls of the dry dock, walls that had been built to hold ships, to resist the pressure of water on the outside, to cradle dead weight, seemed to tighten around the sound. The old dock amplified it, reflected it back on itself. The gantry lanterns trembled above us, and the hanging shadows of the ironwork shifted on the linen tablecloths, and nobody moved. Clift Marsh played with his eyes closed. His shoulders moved with it. His hands, those improbable hands built for silt and steel cable, and the wheel of a dredger, moved across the keys with a fluency that made no earthly sense, and yet was the only thing in the room making sense. The melody returned one last time, shattered, and then gathered, and then shattered again. The final pages of the piece were not a conclusion so much as a reckoning, the pastoral world coming apart at its own seams, the storm taking what it was always going to take, and underneath it, the extraordinary insistence that this was still beautiful. All of it, the violence and the quiet before it. He played the last chord. He held it. The iron walls held it with him. Then he lifted his hands. The silence lasted a long time. In my experience, silence after music tends to last about as long as the audience needs before they remember what their hands are for. This silence lasted longer than that. This was the silence of a room that has had something taken from it, some previous understanding, and has not yet worked out what to put in its place. I was the third or fourth person to stand. I am 68 years old, and my knees do not thank me for it. I stood anyway. The room came up in waves after that, the way a tide comes, not all at once, but each person pulled up by the one before them, until there was no one left sitting except Gerald Farrant. He was standing at the edge of the small stage, the microphone at his side. His face had changed. I had watched it change over the last several minutes, the way a coastline changes, under an unusually high tide, the confident bays filling first, then the headlands, then the whole familiar shape of the thing submerged and replaced by something you do not recognize. He was the last to stand. He stood when there was no one left sitting to provide cover. He did not raise the microphone. He did not speak. Whatever Gerald Farrant had prepared to say after the shanty, he had not prepared anything for after this. He stood, and he looked at Clift Marsh, who had turned on the bench and was looking at the floor, one hand still resting open on the keys. The microphone hung at Farrant's side like a thing he no longer knew the purpose of. For the first time all evening, the room did not need him to tell it what to feel. I spoke to Clift Marsh afterward, at the edge of the dock near the caisson gates, where the old ironwork met the night air off the basin. He had his jacket buttoned against the chill off the water, and he was looking out at the basin the way men who have worked water all their lives tend to look at it, not admiringly, exactly, familiarly, the way you look at something you have spent decades reading. I asked him how long he had been playing. He told me since his early 30s, a pub upright to begin with, then a better one, 40 years on his own, working through the pieces he wanted to work through, alone in a back room while the television was on elsewhere in the house. I asked him if he had ever played for anyone before tonight. He thought about it, once, he said, my wife. The morning she came home from hospital, she asked me to. He did not elaborate. I did not ask. I have spent a career reading the hidden geometry of water, the channels that carry more than they show, the depths that have no surface sign, the currents moving 50 feet down while the surface lies flat and uncommunicative. I had thought this was the particular mystery of my profession, a technical thing, a question of instruments. On the walk back along the dock that night, with the lanterns still lit above the old gantry and the basin moving quietly below the retaining wall, I understood that I had been measuring the wrong thing for 35 years. The depth was never in the water. It was always in the people passing over it,